So welcome, everybody. My name is Paolo Gaudiano, and today I'm going to talk about how to deal with DEI backlash. And this conversation is going to be very different for those of you that have been to some of my prior webinars and workshops. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind on a number of different topics. We have a fairly small audience. I was expecting about 10 people. Looks like we have 8 so far, so we're getting close to that. And I encourage you, if you have any questions, you can pop them into the chat. I may or may not see them, even though I have the chat window open. I have multiple windows. It gets a bit confusing. You're more than welcome to unmute yourself and jump in. And for those of you that have seen me speak before, before I dive into the content, I always like to address what I jokingly call the white elephant in the room, and that's me. What is a white, cisgender, male, heterosexual, fully privileged individual doing, talking to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And briefly, I came into it from an unusual angle, from a very analytical angle. I had a realization about 9 years ago that I might be able to bring this wealth of work that I've done in understanding the links between individuals and organizations or societies. And I thought I might bring back to DEI, and I was able to do that successfully. I got very excited about it. And so about as I said, almost 9 years ago, I literally dropped everything that I was doing and started to focus entirely on DEI. I've been able to do a lot of work in this area, touching on a lot of different topics, all of it really driven by my analytical background, which brings kind of a unique perspective, of course, partly because of the fact that I'm white and cisgender and fully privileged, et cetera, and partly because of my very technical background that I brought into this space. And today what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different from previous talks because I'm really going to focus on the backlash. And I'm going to start with just a couple of slides about just sort of characterizing what I mean by the backlash. And then what I'm going to try to do is to give you a bunch of sort of like problem solution, where we're going to talk about, for example, why diversity through recruiting is a problem and how you can address the problem by focusing on retention. We're going to talk about the problems of focusing on diversity alone as a measure and how inclusion can actually be an additional metric. We're going to talk about the business case for DEI and why there are some flaws in that actually lead to backlash. And we'll talk about how we can instead change the focus to the business impact on DEI for specific organizations. We'll talk about the claim that diversity creates growth and focus on the fact that instead on the fact that exclusion can create losses. And that creates a very different mindset from the point of view of business people. One of the things I'm also going to talk about is the fact that so much of DEI work is focused on trying to fix the behaviors of individuals. And I'm going to suggest that instead, we really need to focus much more on fixing some aspects of organizations. I'm going to talk about something, and by the way, all of these are very just light snippets. I've given individual webinars on each of these. And in fact, in actually almost a month, on June 12th, I'm going to talk specifically about setting diversity targets, but I will give you an idea here of why it's actually dangerous to do that and why we can actually set targets based on equity. And then I'm going to end with 2 things about leaders, the fact that they cannot see exclusion and why that has profound implications for the backlash and how we can help to make exclusion visible. And then I'm going to suggest that instead of focusing on identity, we should let the data speak and tell us where there are issues that have to do with identity. And then we'll wrap up. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind. I have a lot of slides. I hope to get through all of them. But as I said, I'm more than happy to take questions along the way. So let's talk about the backlash, and this is kind of the way that the last several years have felt to me. When I first got into DEI, not a lot of people were really talking about it in 2015. Then in 2020, there was this huge wave of interest in DEI, which has since then been met by this very, very dark wave of anti-DEI backlash. And that really began with the elimination of affirmative action from the Supreme Court as a way for academic institutions to select incoming students. And then it spread to corporate, it spread to academia. In fact, I just came back from giving a talk. I was part of a debate at a university in Canada where there was one person speaking against DEI and one for DEI. And I have to tell you, I was very much behind enemy lines. And it was really kind of shocking to see the vitriol and really the, people basically saying we need to completely kill DEI for the next 10 years. And these are academics, right? I mean, I have my own thoughts about that. And more generally, if you look across society, it's gotten to the point where words like woke and DEI have become insults in some circles. And I'm going to do a little bit of an I told you so, and I apologize for doing that, but I just want to help you understand that these are not things that I'm thinking about today because I'm trying to figure out how to deal with the backlash. I actually wrote in 2018, in April of 2018, I wrote an article in Forbes talking about why companies should stop focusing on diversity alone. And in the quote that you see here, I said, the continued push for diversity can lead to backlash from members of the privileged majority who feel that their company is discriminating against them. And the backlash can propagate to entire industries and in some cases to society as a whole, as evidenced by recent attacks on affirmative action. Now, I don't think of myself as a futurist, but I think I nailed it pretty well. And some of the reasoning that led me to make those predictions, those unfortunately accurate predictions, are going to be reflected in some of the things I'm going to talk about today. And let me silence my phone so that I don't hear little dinging, etc. So let me go through the various things that I said. So the first thing that I said that I want to address is this issue of the fact that a lot of people focus on diversity primarily through recruiting. So when we think about how diversity can benefit an organization by being able to attract more people, by being able to retain those people, by increasing productivity and innovation, by increasing reputation, unfortunately, most companies focus only on recruitment. And the reality is that, and again, if you've been to some of my other workshops, I go much more into the details. But what I want to point out to people is that the problem is actually with retention. And one of the data points that I've used before is to look at data from McKinsey and Lean In, their most recent Women in the Workplace study, which actually looks beyond just gender. And this has been a pattern for years and years and years. But they show that at the entry level, the representation of white men is actually not that high. It's 34%. White women is 29%, women of color 18%, and men of color 18%. But what happens as these people advance through the organization is that we get a dramatic reduction in the representation of people, and we get a dramatic of people from underrepresented groups and women, and we get a dramatic overrepresentation of men. They pick up a staggering 23% of representation. So what this shows very clearly is that the problem is not that we need to recruit more people into this kind of organization. We have a leaky bucket. And just pouring more water in from the top is just going to make more of a mess. So what we need to do is we need to figure out why retention is an issue. And I think that the sooner we stop focusing on recruitment and we start focusing on retention, the happier everybody will be. Now, it turns out that in the context of retention, I want to point out that this is not just limited to corporations. And this was actually a very useful exercise when I was speaking at a university recently. And I went out of my way and found some data from the American Council on Education. And I'm going to show you 3 lines, and you can see the 3 points. So I'm showing you the representation of Black or African American in blue, Hispanic or Latino in orange, and Black and white people as a black line, starting at the graduate student level as they advance through a typical what are known as tenure track roles. And you see something very similar, right? You see that white men, or men, in this case, it's white people in general, there's similar data related to gender, but you see that the representation of white people in academic roles rises from 56% to 85%, while the representation of Black people drops from 14% to 4%. So I apologize, I should say minus 10%, not minus 15%. And then the representation of Hispanic or Latino drops from 9% to 3%. And very, very recently, there was an article in HBR in which they did a similar analysis of the nonprofit sector, where also we see exactly the same pattern. In fact, what was interesting about this is that the nonprofit sector tends to be dominated by women. And you find at the entry level, at the staff level, you have roughly 70% women. But as you go up the echelon, you have increasing numbers of men. And in fact, it turns out that when you look at the amount of money that is managed by organizations run by men and by women, by philanthropic organizations, by nonprofits, there's a staggering difference where the vast majority of that, or a significant majority of that, goes to men. So how do we fix that? Well, we need to focus on retention. And one thing that I want to point out is that for those of you that know my work, I always like to think about the link between the individual and whatever collective they're in. So in this case, here's an individual and here is a company. So think of this as employee within the organization. What is retention exactly? Well, if you think about it, you start your job as an employee, you go to work day in and day out, and then at some point you leave that job. Why do you leave that job? Well, you leave that job as a function of your comparing your state of satisfaction where you are with all the other options out there. So what that means is that retention is very clearly tied to your experiences in the workplace. And in fact, more specifically, one of the things that I often talk about in the context of inclusion is the fact that satisfaction is at the heart of retention in an organization. And what causes satisfaction? Well, as an individual, your satisfaction is dependent on all of the things that you see or that happen to you day in and day out at work. It's about whether or not you're able to use the skills that you were trained to have, whether you're being respected and recognized for your work, whether you're compensated adequately, and so on and so forth. And here's the key. To the extent that different people have different experiences because of their identity traits, you're going to see different levels of retention. So again, we should start to focus on retention and understand that diversity is tied to retention because different experiences lead to different levels of retention. However, one point that I want to underscore, which leads me to the next point, is that unfortunately, we've been focusing very much as a field on diversity alone, or I would say very, very primarily on diversity. Why? Well, because we have bad experiences at work. It's difficult to quantify them, but we see the numbers like the ones that I showed you a moment ago. We see that we're bleeding women and people of color and people with disabilities and members of the LGBTQ plus community. And so we measure diversity. But it turns out that that is a problem. And in fact, I've argued before, and some of you have heard me speak about the fact that even though we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the vast majority, if not the only metric that we tend to use, is only about diversity. But here is the problem. Diversity is not a very good measure to use because it's actually an indirect and lagging indicator. And I kind of like to joke. I try to ask Dali to, I said, give me a picture of a blindfolded man that's trying to find his way using one of those walking canes for the visually impaired, but it's very long and made of rubber, right? That's essentially what diversity is doing. Diversity is telling you about things that take a long time to change, and they're influenced by a lot of factors. So it's a lagging indicator, and it's very indirect. And trying to find your way through just by measuring diversity is completely hopeless. Instead, what I've suggested, and here for those of you that have been to some of my presentations on measuring inclusion, is that we should focus on inclusion. And I've argued before that inclusion is about what you do and diversity is what you get. And I'm going to show you one of the computer simulations that led me to do the work that I'm doing today, or really that's the foundation of the work that I'm doing, just to underscore this point before we move on to some of the other pluses and minuses that I've suggested, that I've indicated at the beginning. So for those of you that have not seen this before, this is a computer simulation that replicates the day-to-day activities that happen within a typical organization. This organization has 4 layers of employees, from entry-level, management, VPs, and executives. For simplicity, there are only 2 kinds of people that identify as men and women, not suggesting that gender is binary, but as you will see, this can be generalized to any identity trait, but to make a very simple point. When I run the simulation under normal circumstances, you see some people floating up as they get promoted to higher and higher levels while the company grows. Some people turn gray and disappear when they separate from the company. But no matter how many times you run the simulation, you find that the company always stays roughly 50-50 at every level. What happens now if we introduce a bias in the way that people are being promoted? And what I did is I simply made one little change that I see as a form of exclusion that gives men a leg up on the competition when there is an opportunity for promotion. Not that it ever happens in real companies, right? But what would happen if we do this in the simulated company? Rerun the same simulation, start at 50-50, change one parameter, and lo and behold, what we find is after 5 years, we get exactly the kind of imbalances that we see in real companies. And these should look familiar. It's very similar to the data that I just showed you a minute ago from corporations, from academic institutions, from nonprofits. And in fact, with my colleague Chibin Zhang, we wrote an academic paper that was published in a peer-reviewed journal in which we were able to show that we can capture data from a variety of industries using this very simple model. So this really is about focusing on the wrong targets. And the focusing on diversity, it can be a red herring. Focusing on inclusion and retention instead of focusing on recruitment are 2 very valuable things that you can do. But I want to talk about another problem that I think has been behind the backlash, and that is what I hear people talk about, the business case for DI. And I'm going to apologize in advance if some of my comments may seem a bit controversial, but every time that I hear somebody who's a DI practitioner talk about the business case for DI has been proven, I am sorry, but those kinds of claims are actually, in my opinion, causing more harm than they're causing good. And let me explain what I mean by that. Most of the business case arguments that I've seen are focused on looking for correlations between various aspects of diversity and various aspects of performance. So for example, executive gender and ethnic diversity correlate with profitability, or above average diversity correlates with higher innovation revenues. Now, just so that you don't think I'm the only one that's complaining about these things, A few years back, this is actually back in 2020, two people that are actually very, very well-respected DI practitioners that have been doing this for years said none of the claims about the business case for diversity is actually supported by robust research findings. And this is something that has been known. And if I had $1 for every time that somebody writes an article that says the business case has been proven, and they cite another article that cites another article that cites another article, when you go dig down deep enough, you find that actually the research is not that robust. And this is about the macroscopic aspect of the impact of diversity, or the alleged one. But there is another more direct claim that a lot of people have made, that diverse teams perform better. But it turns out that even at the microscopic level of a team, it turns out that there is not actually that much data, and a lot of the data comes from academic exercises under very strict conditions. And again, here too, I would encourage you to find references of actual scientifically valid studies or empirical studies that actually demonstrate data showing that in general diverse teams perform better. It turns out that in fact it is the case, there is evidence that diverse teams perform better on some tasks, like innovation. But how much of your company is actually in charge of innovation? And in fact, it turns out that in some situations, the diversity of teams can actually make things worse. For example, there are data showing that if you have a homogeneous team, it's much better at implementation. So how do you reconcile that? And in fact, by the way, this was an article that just came out literally a month ago. And this was the second, there is a couple of sort of meta studies that have been done. This is very recent. These are not people that are DI haters. These were like very balanced people from a variety of backgrounds who did an enormous study looking at a couple of decades of data. And their conclusion is that even considering a wide range of moderators, we found few instances when the effects of diversity on performance of teams were substantial. And they go on to show again that in some cases you see a positive effect, some cases you see a negative effect. In most cases, you don't see an effect at all. Now, how do we get around this problem? We obviously want to convince leaders that they should focus on diversity, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I tend to do is to focus on the business impact of DEI for a specific company. So if you think back about that chart that I showed you, or not the chart, but the simulation that I showed you, I showed that the lack of inclusion, treating people differently, leads to a different level of diversity than you would like. You get a gender imbalance. But one of the other things that I can show with the simulation is I can track the satisfaction of the individuals. And I know that every time that somebody gets passed over for promotion, their satisfaction will decline. It will come back up over time, but if something happens again, it will decline again. And when I track the level of satisfaction of the men and of the women in the simulation, you get a very clear disparity, where you find that the level of satisfaction for men stays high. Hey, they're happy, they're getting promoted, they think they deserve it. While the women, because of the fact that they're getting passed over for promotion much more frequently than men, they're not satisfied. What's going to happen when they're not satisfied? Well, their productivity will go down, which means that a business is losing money, they're losing revenues, they're losing productivity simply because they're treating women worse than men in this case. And of course, the same argument applies to other aspects of diversity. But there is more, because these women will not stick around, they're going to quit. And when they quit, remember that leaky bucket that I was showing you? Those people that are leaving are very good employees, and you have to replace them, and that costs a lot of money. This is a much more compelling argument because I'm not talking about some abstract average over thousands of companies. I'm saying in your company, if you're not treating people well, if you're not concerned about the experiences of people, it will have a negative impact on diversity, and it will have a negative impact on your business. And incidentally, I want to underscore a subtle but very, very important difference with what I think is another problem that I've indicated at the beginning, which is that this argument that diversity creates growth. And again, I'm going to use the same slide that I used before, right? You kind of get the sense of, oh, look, if you have more diversity, you're going to see growth in your organization. But actually, these arguments are flawed. They're flawed for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's because correlation does not imply causality. And everybody hears that sentence, and let me just give you an example of what that means. All that really means is that if A and B tend to happen together, you cannot conclude that A caused B or that B caused A. It could be either of those. It could be a coincidence, or very often there is a common factor that is driving both. Now, just to make you understand how silly some of these arguments are when you look at them from a neutral or let's say an anti-DI perspective. Imagine that somebody did a study in which they looked at the relationship between the yellowness of your teeth and the probability that you have lung cancer. And they find that, lo and behold, there is a correlation where the yellower your teeth are, the more likely it is that you have lung cancer. And now they say, look, here's a tooth whitener. Use this tooth whitener, it will prevent lung cancer. Now, in a case like that, it's clearly a silly idea. But unfortunately, when we claim that the correlation between the level of diversity of organizations across hundreds of organizations is actually causing the change in performance, we're making the same mistake. We may be right, but we may be completely wrong. But there is another point, which is that even if you believe that the correlation is actually reflecting a causal link, the problem is that correlations cannot help you to predict the impact on a single organization. It's just simply not possible. If you think about it, leaders don't use average indicators to make decisions. You don't just look at the average performance of ads from every company, let's say in your sector, and then say, oh, the average, on average, red ads perform better or red products perform better. So I'm going to make all my products red. That's not how it works. And individual DI initiatives, unfortunately, rarely are able to show a measurable impact. And so when you take all of these things, remember what I said before, right? That diversity measures are kind of a lagging indirect indicator. So when you take all of these things together and you go around promising to leaders that diversity is going to create growth, and then that doesn't happen, and you're using arguments that are somewhat questionable to begin with, you're going to create some backlash. So how do you get around that? Well, and this goes back to what I was saying, an important difference with what I suggested before. If I go back to that chart that I showed you a moment ago, right, where I showed you that exclusion actually causes losses, because now you have an organization in which you have less diversity, but also because of less satisfied people are leaving the organization, which is going to reduce your revenues, your productivity, and it's going to increase your costs through unwanted churn. It turns out you can quantify that. And in fact, recently, some of you know that I've released a calculator that my colleagues and I developed, in which, making some very reasonable assumptions, we can estimate for any organization the amount of money that they're losing through a combination of lower productivity and lower retention rates, and how that correlates to the level of inclusion of these various different groups. And in fact, one of the things that you can go to our website, you can play with the calculator yourself. Now, the version you see on the website is a very simple version, but this can be customized to the data of any organization to give them a much more accurate estimate. We estimate that a typical 2,000-person company is likely to lose about $10 million a year because of low inclusion levels of women and other historically underappreciated groups. And I can tell you that in 2022, at the end of the year, there was an article, somebody leaked a memo from Amazon. By their own estimate, they're losing $8 billion a year from unwanted churn. 8 billion with a B. Now that's out of a net profit of $32 billion. These are very big numbers. Now, all of this that I've said so far is about how we position DEI and what arguments we use to convince people about the importance of DEI. And I've talked about the fact that inclusion is very important and that depends a lot on the kinds of behaviors that people have in the organization. Are you promoting people fairly? And of course, there is a million other things that can impact the experiences and the satisfaction of individual employees. However, one of the other big problems that I have, and I've also written about this extensively, is that unfortunately, a lot of the focus on DEI and DEI training has been on trying to fix individuals. And one of the favorite activities to do, especially after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, was for companies to do unconscious bias training. And unconscious bias, if you go online and you look for definitions, there is a million different kinds of unconscious bias. And I don't know how many billions of dollars have been spent on doing unconscious bias training. The goal of unconscious bias training, presumably, is to show people that their biases are leading them to exhibit bad behaviors, which have a negative impact on the organization, and so try to stop those biases. Now, I happen to believe there's actually a lot of research that shows that unconscious bias training is ineffective at best and often can be counterproductive. But I'm going to take you through a very simple thought experiment. And I'm going to do that by asking you, and normally I would do a poll, but I didn't set it up this time. You can do a show of hand or whatever. If I show you 6 pictures and I tell you that these are all pictures of a particular kind of thing, and I ask you to tell me, what kind of things are you seeing on the screen? Are they airplanes? Are they people? Are they fish? Are they chairs? Are they food? Or are they computers? I think that most of you would understand that these are chairs. But now here's what's interesting. How did you know? Even though you've probably never seen these specific chairs, you recognize them as such. And that's because of the way that our brain works. Our brain is exquisitely good at what we call categorization. It's the rapid and subconscious process of identifying an object as belonging to a category. And unconscious biases are simply a reflection of our brain's need to recognize things quickly. Now, here is what's very interesting. I don't deny that they exist. They absolutely exist. But in and of themselves, unconscious biases are actually useful and necessary for survival. And even when they relate to negative perceptions of groups of people or negative stereotypes, they can actually be relatively harmless. There was a fascinating study by Phil Atiba-Goff, who's at Yale and at the Center for Policing Equity, who did a study in which he showed that police officers who had been tested initially and put on a scale of how racist they were, it turns out that the more racist ones were the ones that were least likely to engage in violent behavior toward a drunk Black man in a simulated exercise. So, and as he says in his TEDx talk, racism is not about attitudes, it's about behaviors, okay? Now, why am I saying that this is not so impactful in terms of the individual? Well, because individual biases can be bad, but they can be problematic when they impact the experiences of other people. And here's why, instead of trying to fix the biases of individual people, I believe that we need to focus on the organization. So this is sort of the counter to the problem of trying to fix people. What do I mean by that? I have been writing about and speaking about the idea of organizational biases. And I want to use a simple example to highlight what I mean by that. This here is an article that was written now a few years ago, but it talked about a problem with one of the Tesla factories. And Tesla has been sued numerous times on issues of race, on issues of gender, on a number of other issues. And I want to focus on what was said in this particular one. This gentleman, Aaron Craven, was quoted by saying that when he clocked into work every day at the Tesla Fremont factory, he knew that he might hear or be called the N-word. When he walked into the bathroom stalls, he knew he might see graffiti of KKK or swastika, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Individual biases, which in this case were clearly not unconscious, by the way, were the reason why Aaron Craven felt disrespected during his work. It was the bigotry and racism, overt, not unconscious, of a manager. But there is an organizational bias at play that allowed these exclusionary behaviors to impact large numbers of people. Now, interestingly, in that article, there is a quote by a senior leader at Tesla who says, hey, our company has more than 10,000 employees in the Fremont factory alone, so it is not humanly possible to stop all bad contact. So Tesla is assuming that it's an individual bias issue. But that's completely wrong, because the problem is not that that manager was a jerk. The problem was that in this case, Tesla did not have any policies in place that said, if you get accused of it once, you're going to be put on warning. If you do it twice, you're going to get fired. And that's why I say that organizational biases are the worst. In other words, there are biases that come in the flavor of processes, policies, and systems within every organization that are very harmful potentially because they allow individual biases to impact large numbers of individuals. And that is the real problem. And by the way, again, I've written extensively about this, but there are actually 3 different mechanisms that biases can influence outcomes through policies, through processes or systems. One example is when you have a policy, process, or system that is itself biased. For example, if you say, I'm only going to recruit from Ivy League schools, you are embracing an implicitly biased policy because it means that you're favoring highly privileged individuals. On the other hand, you might have a situation in which something allows individual biases to impact outcomes for multiple individuals. An example of that is if you have an unstructured process for performance reviews, for interviews, anything like that allows individual biases to go unchecked. But the third example, which is the one that I gave you with Tesla, is when there is a lack of a policy or a process or a system that could actually block biases that are known to exist. These kinds of biases are really nasty. And I think that they have a much, much, much bigger impact than the conscious or unconscious biases that we individually carry. So how do we deal with that? Again, I have a whole talk when I go through this, but I want to mention just one aspect of it, and you will see how it ties to some of the things that I've talked about. My suggestion is that in any organization, you have a lot of processes, a lot of policies, a lot of systems, and what you should do is measure who goes in and who comes out. In other words, look for disparities in outcomes. So this is how you can actually tell whether any of your processes or systems are biased or not. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment in the context of looking at diversity targets. By the way, on June 12th, I'm giving a talk specifically. It's going to be much more detailed about the problem with focusing on diversity targets. So keep that picture in mind of measuring processes, and you'll see how it relates to this. Now, I believe that focusing on diversity alone as the targets of an organization is possibly one of the biggest reasons for the backlash. And there are several reasons why actually it's caused problems. One problem, by the way, is that even leaving aside the backlash is that it's incredibly difficult to come up with a meaningful set of targets. For example, should your representation targets be based on the representation of the general population? If so, what area do you select? Is it, if your company is only in one city, do you look at your city? Do you look at your state? Do you look at the whole country? What if you have locations, headquarters in one place and buildings all over the place? How do you do that? Well, some people say, well, let's set the representation based on our target clients. Hey, if we serve a lot of people of color, we need to have a lot of people of color in our company. Absolutely, certainly for your client-facing people, you should do that. But the problem is that even this is not very defensible. First of all, because not everybody in your organization is facing your clients or designing products for your clients. But secondly, what if you're selling to a homogeneous market? What if you're building golf clubs in a company that's headquartered in New Mexico? Now you have conflicting goals, right? I mean, and I'm using golf clubs, although golf maybe is not the best example, but there are certain products that are clearly aimed at a very homogeneous target. And does that mean that you should build a homogeneous company? There is also some people that suggest that you should look at representation based on educational attainment. And actually, by the way, this is used in the negative very often when people say, oh, the pipeline problem, we couldn't get enough Black people with an engineering degree or women with a computer science degree. Now, in reality, it turns out that I have a whole other talk about the pipeline problem. But really what it boils down to is, where do you look for your talent? I mean, okay, so maybe statistically speaking, there are not as many women that get computer science degrees, but if all you're going to do is just like, it's not like your company is an open field and people just randomly walk through, and you should be satisfied with whatever percentages are out there. And then lastly, at what levels do you apply this target? Even if you can come up with a rational target, at what level do you apply it? Should it be at the level of the whole company? Should it be applied to every department? Should it be applied on every team? Which, by the way, one of the problems that I've seen is when organizations try to hold leaders and managers at farther down levels accountable for DI targets, and those targets are based on diversity, it's a mess. Because you cannot expect a team of 20 people or even a division of 100 people to have perfect diversity targets. It's just not reasonable. And some teams, again, it might make more sense to be more homogeneous, some to be less homogeneous. Again, the focus on diversity is a red herring, because the question is not how many people of each type do you have, it's how are they treated in the organization? Are their ideas taken seriously? Do they have the opportunity to advance? So setting diversity targets is a dangerous thing because it's very difficult to justify any actual targets based on representation alone. But as I hinted before, and many of you have heard me speak about this in the context of other presentations, it leads to claims of reverse discrimination, which I believe, and in fact, I know through the data that we collect, that it's at the very heart of the wild backlash that we're seeing right now. And unfortunately, when you take a very narrow view and only think about diversity, and especially when you focus primarily on recruitment, it's entirely reasonable to conclude that setting diversity targets is a form of reverse discrimination. And let me give you an example. Imagine you have a company of 1,000 people, of whom 20% identify as white women, 5% women of color, 5% men of color. I am purposefully using the same buckets and the same colors that I used in the earlier example from McKinsey and Lean In, because I want to emphasize that if you come out with a set of targets and you say, listen, we're going to raise the number of women or the percentage to 30%, the percentage of women of color to 8%, and men of color by 3%. And because we believe that diversity is so good, we're going to see the company grow by 20%. Unfortunately, when you do that, you're still going to be discriminating against white men, because you're not going to be able to get there unless you decrease the number of white men while you're increasing the number of everybody else. And as I said before, when we do that, we're focusing on the wrong thing. We have that leaky bucket. We need to understand why we're leaking out all of those people. The problem is not that you want to hire 160 more women and 46 more men of color and 46 women of color and fire 52 people. But when you present it that way, it's an entirely logical conclusion, and people complain about it all the time. So how do you get around that? Turns out that one way to do that, which goes back to that diagram that I asked you to think about, is that you can actually set equity targets. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you define equity as equal outcomes for all people across processes, policies, and systems in your organization, then it gives you a very, very simple universal target. Set all inequities to 0. In other words, all you have to do is say, look, we promoted 100 people last year. Of the people that could have been promoted, 30% were women, 5% were Black men, 5% were Black women, and so on and so forth. When we look at who was actually promoted, only 20% were women and only 2% were Black people. If you see that, then you know there is an inequity, and your goal is drive that inequity to 0. Stop the leaking bucket. So what that does is that it creates a lot of benefits, because first of all, it gives you much more granular insights into the causes of disparities. Because if you see a process that's not working, you can analyze that process and understand what is happening. Also, another thing that's wonderful is that now every manager has visibility and control over any kind of a process or policy that they oversee, which means that they can be held accountable. And all you have to do is to ask them to measure. Just measure. Make sure that you're tracking data about whatever process you're managing, whether your process is assigning clients to people, to salespeople, or assigning people to different teams and different projects, or giving bonuses or giving promotions. You can track the data in each of those, and then the manager can be accountable for the things over which they actually have control. And it turns out that this is a relatively easy process that you can embed in every part of the organization. And when people talk about the difficulty of embedding DI in every part of the organization, that's, to me, kind of the wrong way to think about it. You think about it as a bolt-on that you have to go and add to every piece. I think of diversity, equity, and inclusion like finance. We measure where money is going out the door. We always track that. And if a manager came to you and said, no, I don't feel like wasting my time tracking where my money is going, you would probably fire them. And all I'm asking people to do is exactly the same thing. Just simply measure the people that are going through your processes. It's not that difficult. Do it throughout the organization, roll it up, have a DI department that, just like finance tracks money assets, DI should track personnel assets, I should say. And if you do that, it'll actually be relatively easy, and people will be held accountable. Now, the last couple of things that I want to talk about, this is another very, very interesting thing that I believe is actually a significant reason for the backlash that often gets completely overlooked. And that is the fact that leaders cannot see exclusion. And again, for those of you that have already heard me speak about measuring inclusion, I apologize for the repetition, but I want to point out that inclusion itself is invisible. And I like to use the analogy that inclusion is like health, in the sense that I typically do not notice when I'm healthy, but I sure notice when I'm sick. If I were sick today, I might have said something about it, but I didn't start out by saying, hi, I'm Paul and I'm very healthy. Inclusion works the same way. we tend to notice exclusion when we don't have it. In other words, what we see is exclusion, not inclusion. And here is where it ties to the backlash. If you're a very healthy individual, you're unlikely to even know the names of diseases. You will not know what the symptoms are. And even if somebody tells you the symptoms, you have no idea how severe they are. And you certainly do not know how to cure the disease. And inclusion is exactly the same way. Because exclusion is hardest to see for those that are very healthy from an inclusion perspective, those people are the ones that are the least able to understand what exclusion is. They don't see it. If somebody tells them about the symptoms, they're unlikely to believe it unless it's actually measured and put in front of them. And they have absolutely no clue how to fix it. So when I hear people say that, oh, the reason for the backlash is because leaders are resisting and they want to hold on to the power, I'm sorry, but that's false. I know a lot of leaders who look like me, who would love to do the right things, who have actually understood through the last 4 years how important DEI actually is for the satisfaction, happiness, well-being, productivity, retention of their employees. They just don't know what to do, and it's invisible to them. The problems are invisible. So how do you fix that? Sorry, I just said this, that the very people who run organizations are the least aware of the problems, right? So how do you fix that is you make inclusion visible to them. Again, a lot of you have actually been to my talks where I talk about the idea of measuring inclusion by actually asking people about workplace experiences that have interfered with their ability to perform. And then we categorize them. And remember that thing that I had with the satisfaction in the middle and all of these different categories, that's what these are. So we think of these as being clusters of symptoms. And we also want to know, why are you having this experience? You know, it's just like if you say something hurts, you might say, did you fall down and hurt yourself? Or if you're sniffling, you might say, have you traveled somewhere overseas recently? And so we also ask about experiences. We ask people to share situations and then tell us which of those categories, and was it something that has to do with the policy, with your leadership, with your department, with your manager? And when we do that, we get incredible data, such as, for example, this chart from a large organization, in which we can look at the intersection of these categories and sources and identify hotspots where there are significant problems. We can use that to derive information about diversity. So instead of starting with diversity and trying to figure out what's happening, look at the data and let it highlight whether there are any differences. The data I'm showing you was from a brand new study. We did an industry-wide benchmark in cybersecurity, working with an organization called Women in Cybersecurity. And when we measured exclusion, we found that overall, the level of exclusion of women is more than 2 times as high for women as it is for men. And when you break that down by the individual categories that influence people's satisfaction, productivity, retention, we find that in some cases, there was as much as a 4.5 times difference in the experiences of women compared to men. This was in the recognition category. But many of these other categories, like being respected in the workplace, career and growth, you have more than a 2x difference between women and men. But I want to emphasize another very important point, which leads me to one of the last bullet points on my list of pros and cons, is the fact that, unfortunately, what a lot of people have been doing historically is to focus on identity. Let's understand the experiences of queer Black women with a disability. And I'm not suggesting that that's not important, but I think that when we lead with that, we create this sense of differences. We make people feel like they don't belong. And we create the backlash. And in fact, I want to share with you, as part of these studies that we do, people submit these experiences anonymously, but we ask for permission, and they have to give us explicit permission to share some of their experiences in presentations like this one. And so I'm going to show you some examples. I'm going to show you 2 slides. The first slide are people who identify as white and male, and typically heterosexual, cisgender, etc., how the focus on identity has impacted them negatively, or how they perceive that it's impacted them. So the organization has shown very clearly in the past year that it does not value white males. As a conservative-leaning white straight man, you feel like the outcast in most meetings. The organization has constantly pushed diversity and inclusion with frequent emails and news posts about minorities while excluding white men. I was passed over for a program because I'm not diverse enough. My promotion was delayed by 3 months because HR told me that they had to find some Black people to interview. Now, leaving aside whether these comments underlie some sort of entitlement, some sort of blindness, some sort of unawareness, or in the case of the last one, a completely inappropriate behavior on the part of the HR department that actually said that to someone, the fact is that this is how people feel. And that focus on identity makes people from what I call HUGs, historically underappreciated groups, also feel excluded. So these comments that I'm going to show you now are from people who were not white men. For example, I've had white men say to me that they do not think they should apply to higher level roles because they're not diverse and will not be considered competitive. The organization introduced the Juneteenth holiday with great fanfare in 2022, only to move into 2023. This is more talking about how they're focusing on identity and then it becomes performative and they remove that. Or somebody this is tokenization, being asked to develop, organize, or deploy materials about Islamic observances by the IMD committee, even though I'm not part of them anymore, because I'm the only practicing Muslim that they know. Or somebody complaining, and again, this was not a white man complaining about this. The term equity has become synonymous with discrimination, and it underscores a process where employees are selected for roles based on desired outcomes rather than on a fair and unbiased selection process. And there are many more people that complain that they're treated as a diversity hire, people that worry that they're feeling excluded by everybody because of the fact that a lot of DI initiatives that are focusing on identity are making them feel very different. So my suggestion is to let the data speak. And when we measure inclusion, and then we cross it with different identity traits, we see that very clearly. And I showed you before data about gender, but it's not just gender, right? So this is the data from a fairly large data set in which we basically said, well, what if we take everybody that identifies as a man and everybody that identifies as something other than a man, which we call women plus? What is their exclusion score? So you can see the number at the bottom here and the number at the top, and you can see there's a huge difference in terms of gender. But if you do white against those that identify as something other than white, or if you do heterosexual versus those that identify as LGBTQ+, or people without a disability versus those that do have a disability, you find that across every traditional identity trait, we see significant differences that always work to the advantage of those who identify as members of the majority. And in fact, part of the work that we've done has made us realize that focusing obsessively on specific identities is a bit counterproductive, but there is a different way to look at it that actually makes it possible to think about intersectionality in what I think is a slightly more productive way. The chart that you see here is also a radar chart, where being close to the center means there's less exclusion, being more on the edges means that there is more exclusion. And what we did is that we assigned what we call a diversity degree. So a degree 0 would be a member of the majority who would be white, cisgender, heterosexual, male with no disabilities. When we look at degree 1, it means that it's anyone who differs along one and only one of those dimensions. So for example, it could be a black cisgender heterosexual male with no disabilities, or a white cisgender gay male with no disabilities, and so on and so forth. Likewise, degree diversity 2 differs along 2 dimensions, and degree diversity 3 along 3 or more dimensions. And what you see as that grows is that there's a very dramatic impact even of going from degree 0 to degree 1, and that increases even more when you go to degree 2 and even more when you go to degree 3. In other words, the intersectionality, the impact of being different from the majority falls out in the data because it makes sense. Because the kinds of experiences that people share, some of them are very directly linked to their identity, but many of them are not. Like being interrupted in a meeting, or not being invited to the meeting, or not being given the opportunity to participate in some big projects. Those sometimes are correlated. They're more likely to be correlated with people that are different from the majority, whether that's because of their race or because of their sexual orientation or because of their gender identity or their disability. And the more of those identity traits separate you, the more likely it is that you will be impacted by it. But it's a very different way that acknowledges intersectionality. It acknowledges identity without forcing us to create these smaller and smaller boxes and looking for very narrow experiences that, quite frankly, are not entirely realistic. Meaning that even if you could find a bunch of women in the organization that have, they're all queer and have a disability and maybe come from a foreign country and are Muslim, the probability that we would all have exactly the same experiences is very unlikely. And they probably would not like being all plugged into that. So we need to be very mindful when we think about that. So I want to wrap up, and I hope that you got something valuable out of this, which is that I hope that some of the key takeaways, one of the best antidotes to the backlash is to become really focused on measurement, but you need to measure the right things. We need to move beyond just measuring diversity and representation. We need to also start measuring things like inclusion and equity. Also, blaming individuals or expecting that the way to fix these problems is based on changing the hearts and minds and implicit behaviors of individuals is a chimera. It's not going to happen. What we need is to actually hold people accountable, but we need to make sure that we're doing it at the level of organizations first and individuals secondarily. Another thing that I encourage people to do is we have this tendency, we live in our own bubbles. We hear something, it sounds good, we repeat it, sometimes without doing the fact checking that we should do. We should all learn to avoid arguments that are unproven and promises that we can't keep. If we go to a leader and we say, hey, you know what? Diversity is going to make your company better. And then they spend a lot of money and they don't see any change. And in fact, what they see is it gets worse because now the white men are complaining. That's not going to work very well. That's going to lead to backlash too. And then, as I've already hinted at, don't blame leaders, don't blame individual employees. And I give you different arguments. One is about unconscious bias. The other one is about the invisibility of exclusion. Instead, help them to see and understand the benefits. And I want to close with one last comment. There is something that I hear a lot of my DEI practitioner colleagues say that I also find a little bit disturbing. DEI is a marathon, it's not a sprint. It takes a lot of work. It's very hard. If you are a white male leader who is dealing with internal backlash, who's having a problem with this, and somebody tells you how hard it's going to be, do you think that's going to make you more motivated? Probably not. And the reality is that it doesn't have to be that way. And I like to think that especially that idea of measuring equity and looking at individual processes makes you realize that it's actually possible to work on DI in an incremental way where every step of your journey to inclusion is a win. So I hope you enjoyed that. A lot of the topics that I talk about are going to be covered in the book that I've written that's coming out in September. We will be sending a follow-up email in which I will also include links to a variety of Forbes articles that I've written that cover each of the topics that I've gone through here. And then for those of you that are interested in that issue of the targets, and I'm sorry, this was a picture from Dali, which is a little bit gruesome, but I asked him to try to imagine a situation in which somebody is trying to set targets. So I'm giving a talk that focuses in a lot more detail on some of the issues of setting DI targets and how to do DEI, not just difference, but also looking at inclusion and equity in ways that do not lead to reverse discrimination. So that's all. And I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. There are about 5 or 6 minutes left. If you all want to leave, that's great. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to either drop them into the chat or unmute yourself and ask the questions. And again, thank you all for coming.